Okay, looks like our participant level's about leveled off and we're about to noon. So how about we get rolling here? First speaker, or our speaker today will be Sam Zipper, leads the hydroecology of anthropogenic landscapes group at Kansas Geological Survey. The research program seeks to understand how local, regional, and global change impact water resources of Kansas and the Great Plains region now and in the future. Received his bachelor's geology from Pomona College, PhD in freshwater and marine science from University of Wisconsin-Madison, and postdoc at McGill University before joining the Geological Survey. It looks like you got a website there. I'll throw the link in the chat here, and yeah, feel free to take us off here, Sam.
All right, thanks. Yeah, let me get my screen set up here. Switch. There we go. Hopefully that looks okay to everyone. Yeah, thanks for the introduction, and thanks everyone for sticking around for the private lunchtime session here. I'm really had a good time the past couple days kind of learning about all the work everyone's doing in Kansas, so I've enjoyed it, and hopefully all of you have too, and maybe next year we'll get to do it in person. Today I'm going to be sharing some work that I've been doing with some collaborators in the Arkansas River Basin about stream intermittency and in particular drivers of stability in stream intermittency, and I'll get into what I mean by stability in a few minutes. But first I just want to, let's see, advance my slide. There we go. Give a shout out to the co-authors and collaborators that have helped out with this work. In particular, Kyle and Alinka, who are KGS interns the past 2 summers. If there's any students out there, we hire interns again this summer, so just shoot me an email if you want details on that. As well as Erin Seybold, my colleague here at KGS in the geohydrology section, and Shi Zhang, who is formerly at KU and is now at the University of Vienna. And our fundings come from KWRI and NSF. And I also want to give a shout out. I'm building on data that I didn't collect any of it, so a big shout out to Jim Butler, Ed Ripaway, folks at the USGS, and many others who have worked at this site over the years. So non-perennial streams, Kansas has a lot of them. Someone yesterday shared this slide, I forget exactly who, but a map like this showing that over the past 60 years, Kansas has lost a great number of its perennial streams as they've transitioned from perennial to non-perennial. So this map is showing Kansas's stream network. The red lines are streams that were perennial in 1961, but as of 2009 are no longer perennial, so they no longer flow year-round. And many of those, it won't be surprising to the folks here to know, are kind of in this area, either overlying or immediately downstream of the High Points Aquifer, where there's been substantial use of water historically for agriculture and other purposes. So we've got a lot of these non-perennial streams. They, are very widespread across the state. And we wanted to look a little bit more into how they're functioning hydrologically and ecologically to see what sorts of groundwater recharge they may provide, or sediment or water quality impacts they may have downstream. So that's kind of the nexus of this overall KWRI project. We're going to zoom in on a site here. This is between the towns of Arlington and Great Bend along the Arkansas. These are pictures of the same stretch of stream bed at 2 very different flow states. This one on the left was from last November, I think, when water levels were pretty high. You can see there's a lot of water there. This one, I'm not sure exactly when the data is. I think that's Jim Butler right there. And I believe this is one of the old KGS legislative field conferences where they were bringing out here and actually giving a presentation in the stream bed because there was no flow at the time. Let's see. So I'm just going to quickly unmute and then mute and then unmute because Richard said there was a bit of microphone feedback. Hopefully that fixes it. We'll see. We'll see if that's any better. Hopefully it is. If not, I'm afraid I don't have another microphone here to mess with. So we'll kind of go with it. So this is a site where the USGS has been monitoring since 1998. I'm showing the long-term hydrograph here from 1998 through the end of the 2021 water year. This is a log scale daily discharge. There's a lot of flow variability here, as we saw in the pictures on the last slide, and that will, so we've kind of log scaled it so that we can really see both the high flows and the low flows. Everything that's shaded yellow in the background is a period of no flow or zero discharge. And you can see, just looking at this hydrograph, that there are really two kind of distinct periods where there were long no-flow events over the past 20 years or so. And these dry periods, really, they can span multiple years. So it's not, kind of the traditional way we think of intermittent or ephemeral streams, where it'll rain and they'll flow, and then they'll sort of dry up when it's been dry for a little while. These are really kind of distinct hydrologic regimes that we're seeing at this site, where they're either dry or they're flowing for long periods of time. So what we wanted to investigate is whether there's evidence of stability in these wet and dry states of the Arkansas River, and if so, what are the feedbacks and interactions that might be creating stability in this hydrological system. So what do I mean when I say stability? So stable states are a concept that's been used a lot in the ecological literature to describe the resilience of a system to change. So I'm showing two kind of, you can imagine this is sort of a ball and a hill type diagram. In this diagram on the left, this ball is kind of showing where our hydrologic system would be, either in a dry condition or a wet condition. And on the left, there's no real impediments to flow. So if there's a little more rain, the system can shift to a wetter condition. If it's a little drier, the system can shift back to a drier condition. So it can really kind of move linearly across hydrologic space in response to the forcings on the system. In contrast, in this diagram on the right, we can see that there's some features in the stability space that impede change between hydrologic states. So if we once again have dry on the left side and wet on the right side, if we're currently in a dry state over here on the left and we have to, and the system is moving towards a wet state, it has to overcome this sort of high potential boundary. These are often kind of referred to as tipping points or bifurcation points, in order to transition from a dry state into a wet state. And once it is in one of these states, it's kind of harder for it to move back and forth compared to the one on the left. And these stable states are created by negative feedbacks. These negative feedbacks kind of hold the system in one of the states of interest. So there's been a number of work, as I mentioned, in the ecological literature about how do we know when there's stable states, and some hints that we can see in ecological time series data are jumps in the time series or multi-modal distributions. This is when controlling for changes in driving factors like precipitation, as well as hysteretic relationships to control factors. So what I'm going to do first is basically review each of these three hints and see if we see evidence for stable states in this system. So jumps in the time series. What I'm plotting here, previously I was showing you discharge through time. What I'm now showing is for each month, the percentage of that month that there was no flow in the river. So a 0% would indicate the river was flowing that entire month. 100% would indicate the river was dry for that entire month. And what we can see is visually there's some very clear jumps. We're moving from perennial flow to non-perennial flow, staying up there, moving back, etc. We can do statistical tests to evaluate whether what our eyes are seeing is what kind of shows up in the numbers. We use an approach called STARS, or sequential testing of auto-regressive regime shifts. And what we identified was that, yes, indeed, what we're seeing is statistically significant. We are seeing shifts from kind of blue wet conditions to red dry conditions, alternating through time. So these colors in the background are indicating where that statistical test indicated we were observing a regime shift in the system. So we can see that there's jumps in the time series. What we now have to check is, are there jumps in the controlling factors? So looking here, we can look at monthly precipitation in this middle plot, and annual water use. We don't have monthly water use data, but we have annual water use data here. This blue and red shading is the same as in that top plot. So these are showing in the background our wet and dry hydrologic regimes. we can see that there's no apparent jumps in either the precipitation or the water use time series. We can see in precipitation that there's a strong seasonal signal where it tends to be less rain or snow in the winter. So a next step that we're going to investigate is removing those seasonal patterns and then running the STARS test. But I would hypothesize that we still won't see any sort of a significant jump that could lead to these sorts of jumps in the hydrologic time series. So, point of evidence 1, we see jumps in the hydrologic time series, we do not see jumps in the controlling factor. That supports our hypothesis that there's stability in the system. Second, let's look at multimodal distributions. So now we've taken that monthly time series data of no flows that I showed you and just made a simple histogram. So now our x-axis is no flow days as a percentage of the month, and our y-axis is just the number of months during the period of record where we have that, where we're in that bin. And what we can see is that we've got a very strongly bimodal distribution here. The number of no-flow days is either less than 10% of a month or greater than 90% of a month in 254 of the 276 months under investigation. So pretty much all the time we're either flowing or not. If we look at the yearly pattern, we have less years than we do months, but we see the same signal. If we then look at our two controlling factors we're investigating, precipitation and water use, we do not see any evidence for multimodality in these. Monthly precipitation is strongly right-skewed. Once again, that's because of the seasonal precipitation dynamics I mentioned earlier. If we aggregated this to annual precipitation, we would see a normal distribution here. And similarly, water use in the surrounding area is a normal distribution. So, line of evidence number 2, we see a strongly bimodal hydrologic distribution and no multimodality in either of our two drivers. Point number 3, and these results are hot off the press. I actually literally just kind of figured this out this morning, so I may kind of bungle my way through it. But looking at a hysteretic response of stream intermitence to climate. So what we can see here in this plot, and I'll walk you through everything on here because it's a bit complicated. On the x-axis is a climatic index called the SPEI, or Standardized Precipitation Evapotranspiration Index. If any of you saw Tom Gorse's presentation this morning, this is the same climatic index he was using. So it considers both the supply of water from precipitation and the demand of water through evapotranspiration, and normalizes it through time to kind of account for those seasonal differences in water. So a negative value is drier and a positive value is wetter. That's really kind of the main thing that you need to understand about this x-axis. This y-axis is once again our no-flow days as a percentage of the month. We've done some smoothing on here just to kind of match the SPEI. We've added up over a year period, so we've smoothed this with a 1 year long moving average filter. And the color here is indicating time. So darker blue is kind of the beginning of sort of a wet in a wet regime. As we move through to kind of the turquoises and turquoises and greens, we're entering the dry regime, and as we go to yellows, we're getting back into that wet regime. So we can use color to look at time on this plot. What we can see is that if we start at the beginning, we're kind of over here in relatively wet conditions in 1998. As we move through time, we're getting drier and drier climatically, moving to the left on the x-axis. Eventually, we hit some critical transition value where we're drier than average, so we're less than 0 for SPEI, and the system starts to dry. We migrate upwards fairly rapidly, moving over the course of about a year from 0% no flow to 100% no flow. Then hang out here for a couple years, and as the climate kind of gets wetter and wetter, so we're moving rightwards on that x-axis into wetter conditions. And what's important to note here is we've moved past this 0 line. So in order to dry the system, we had to move to the left of the 0 line. In order to re-wet the system, we have to move past that 0 line to the right. So that's the hysteresis that we're seeing in this relationship. And then eventually we'll get to kind of a wet enough condition that the system is able to re-wet, and we move back down here to our 0% no flow days. So what this is showing is that once the stream dries, returning to kind of the normal climate is not sufficient to return it to the normal hydrologic regime. So piece of evidence number 3, hysteresis in the relationship between the no-flow regime and the control factor of climatic anomalies. And if we look at that second wet-dry cycle, I'm not going to walk through this plot too. This is for that second kind of drying period. We see the same pattern where you have to dry, and you kind of get your drying portion of the loop over here. You have to move back this way to re-wet, and then you go down here. We do have a brief kind of odd excursion over here where we're getting briefly fairly dry and then moving back to wet without the system drying. So I'm not going to dig into that here, but that's kind of what this little curly Q is. So we've got these three strong lines for stability in the system. So if there is stability, we have to propose a plausible mechanism by which it's occurring. So we're going to look at Stream-Aquifer interactions here. So if you imagine a profile through the subsurface of this site, we've really got kind of four main pieces. We've got the Arkansas River. It's resting on top of an alluvial aquifer, which is about 10 meters or 30 feet in thickness. It's a highly conductive, coarse sand and gravel aquifer. Underneath that is a low permeability clay layer, about 12 feet in thickness or 4 meters. We've got some evidence that it's leaky. So either there's kind of fractures or cracks in it, or it pinches out in places and water is able to pass through it. And then underneath that is the high plains aquifer, where pumping is primarily occurring in this region. It's about 30 meters thick in this area, or 100 feet or so, and it's a sand and gravel aquifer where there's a lot of pumping. I'm going to be focusing on some data from a well nest right here and the USGS stream gauge, which is right here, to compare water levels between the stream, the alluvial aquifer, and the high plains aquifer. So this plot is showing water levels in those three hydrologic settings through time. The blue line is water levels in the stream. Everywhere there's no blue line, that's because the stream is dry, so there's no water level at that point in time. The orange line is water levels in the alluvial aquifer, so that's what's in direct connection with the stream. And the gray line is water levels in the high plains aquifer. And you can see for the high plains, there's kind of a distinct seasonal pumping signal where it goes down in the summer and recovers over the winter. What we can see here is if we compare our dry and wet regimes, once again that's noted by the shading in the background, blue for wet regimes, red for dry regimes that we identified previously in the presentation, we can see that the storage in the aquifer is what's controlling those regime shifts. During wet regimes, we've got a strong upwards gradient in the water system. So the water level is highest in the high plains aquifer, intermediate in the alluvial aquifer, and lowest in the stream. This is indicating the stream is in a gaining condition, so water is flowing from the aquifer into the stream. In contrast, from one of our dry regimes, we've got a downwards hydraulic gradient. So the stream is the highest, though it really is pretty much tracking exactly the alluvial aquifer because it's supporting that alluvial aquifer. And then the high plains aquifer is lowest. So what we're seeing is that the gradient from the aquifer to the stream is what's maintaining flow during the wet regimes and also maintaining no flow during the dry regimes. So what are the feedbacks that are allowing this to occur? What we see is that the climatic water balance and pumping are controlling both the inputs to and the outputs from the aquifer. When we have a long dry period, that kind of drains the tub of the alluvial aquifer, causing a transition to a dry regime. Once we're in a dry regime, the stream is remaining dry and kind of stabilized in that dry state because surface water can pass so easily through the stream bed. So in all the areas upstream, if there is any precipitation events that are causing some flow in the channel, those are all being lost through transmission in the stream bed in those upstream areas. Eventually, if there's enough and kind of long enough of a wet period, those are able to refill the aquifer and return the stream to gaining conditions, which then allows the stream to be maintained in a wet state because those gaining conditions are contributing to increased inflow from upstream. So to kind of sum things up here, what we found is that there's a few long dry periods that are dominating the historical flow intermittency signal at this site. Those dry and wet conditions show strong evidence for stability. We're seeing jumps in time series, we're seeing multi-modal distributions of flow, and we're seeing hysteresis after controlling for the driving factors of climate and water use. So what we think is that stability at this site is driven by feedbacks and interactions between climate, pumping, and stream flow. And what this implies that once we see a transition of a stream from perennial to non-perennial, that transition will be harder to reverse than it was to implement. That's kind of the hysteresis thing that I was talking about earlier. So this points to is kind of a critical need to identify which streams are moving towards these critical transitions and determine if it's possible to address the kind of causative factors in advance of making that transition, because at that point it's much harder to reverse the change. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your time.
Thank you for that, Sam. Looks like we got one question. We got a minute or two here before they close this on us. So from Scott, we got, what do you think the reason for loss of perennial streams in the northeastern part of the state? Is this development, ag range practices, and how much influence does increased infiltration rate have on the base flow?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So I was looking at the west part of the state here, but there has definitely been, kind of on that map I showed at the beginning, we saw some red lines that were sort of scattered around the eastern part of the state. So there's a number of different potential causes. I certainly won't claim to kind of know exhaustively what they are for that region, but a study of the overall Great Plains region by some folks formerly at K-State found that the Great Plains is losing about 9 kilometers of perennial streams every year over the past 70 years. And the factors that they point to at a broader region than just western Kansas, but over the entire region, are fragmentation of the stream network due to kind of reservoirs and impoundments. So if I was going to go out on a limb, and with the caveat I'm saying this without any specific data about it, I would guess that a lot of those red portions you are seeing in parts of the state that are historically wetter and don't have substantial groundwater or surface water diversions may be driven by impoundments of some sort. But again, that's just kind of speculation at this point in time.
You maybe scroll back to that map that you showed with those perennial streams. Then maybe I'll throw one at you. What do you see as kind of next steps for your work? And is there a way that we can move this? Like, any way you can use this as a forecasting mechanism, or just still need to do some more study and development?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think forecasting would be really powerful here. Got Alinka, who I mentioned was our intern last summer, has kind of been digging into a little bit of that for her senior thesis work. So she's exploring whether we can see any sort of early warning signals. I think the next step is there's kind of a few pieces. So along with Erin Seybold and many others that I mentioned, we're kind of working on a big project about intermittent streams to determine what are the impacts on downstream water quality when they're kind of transitioning from dry to wet states and such, or wet to dry. So I think that'll be a big piece. We've got study sites, in the High Plains region as well as in the Flint Hills region. So we'll be able to kind of get a broader piece of the puzzle there. And what I would be really fascinated to find is what kind of fraction or proportion of the overall groundwater recharge to the High Plains Aquifer is coming from these intermittent and ephemeral stream beds. So even though they've transitioned from wet to dry, they still can be providing value to society by kind of feeding and recharging the aquifer locally. So that's an area that I'm really curious to dig into more.
Perfect, sounds great. I'm hoping for some fun updates in the future. Thank you again, Sam.